Hello YouTube and welcome to an all new Elder Scrolls lore video. Today, in accordance with the spooky feel of Halloween, this video will be about the different cultural views and rites about death and passing of each race of Tamriel. That said, this video I got a ton of help with from my friend Mr. Nerddragon in the research department. To be fair, he wrote most of this video as I was focusing on some important exams. So he pretty much made this video and the fact that there's a video at all this week possible. So if you ever come across him, on the internet or in the comments of this video, just tell him he's a cool dude, because he is. That said, Mr. Nerddragon and I hope you enjoyed this video. So, first of all, we must talk a bit about the god or gods who preside over death in the Elder Scrolls. In the majority of cultures, this god would be Arkay, god of the cycle of life and death. Most cultures will ask for his blessing for the departed loved ones, and such rituals are believed to be important to keep the dead safe from the influence of necromancy, a magical art considered to be abhorrent in the eyes of pretty much everyone on Tamriel, although there are some exceptions, as you'll see later in this video. After all, who would like to see their loved ones' spirits bound to the mortal world against their will, basically held in pain and taken from the rest of their, respective afterlives? So, the rituals to Arkay, or whatever aspect of Arkay the different cultures worship, are present in most cultures around Tamriel. Arkay's blessing, in some cases indeed, have the power to prevent or hold off necromancy from being exerted upon the dead body, preventing that soul from being used or interacted with without their consent. Arkay has the 3 consecrations that he gives upon mortals, though only the last 2 really apply for this video. His first consecration is Arkay's Grace, which is bestowed upon birth on a being. It protects the souls of the innocent to keep their free will. Second, we have Arkay's Blessing, bestowed upon the dying, which prevents their souls from being used without consent. And we have Arkay's Law, which prevents the bodies from being raised in unholy rituals post-mortem. That is pretty much everything you need to know about Arkay for this video, but if you want to know more, I have a full video on Arkay in the description of this video. That said, let's go through each culture's exact views on death and their customs regarding to it. So, first we have the Altmer, or the High Elves. The Altmer are interesting, since they have a different god responsible for death than Arkay. They revere Xerxes, the god of history and lore, as the god of the deceased, since he's a scribe who records the lives of all elves. And as scribe, Xerxes records not only the individual lives of all elves, but also their lineages and links to their ancestors, including the Aedra. This, along with the idea that Xerxes was once a mortal elf who ascended to godhood, gets along with the belief of the Altmer that all elves are descendants from the gods, the Aedra, and can even reach apotheosis and return to their godly state as spirits someday. Since nothing matters more for the High Elves than their ancestry and bloodline, Xerxes' role as their major deity of death becomes pretty clear as he records their life for the newer generations as they become ancestors. The Altmer believe that when they die, their spirits directly ascend to Aetherius to join their ancestors. This is seen as a liberation of sorts, since they see mortality as a trickery imposed on them by the betrayer Lorcan to the original spirits and all their descendant generations. They venerate their deceased ones greatly by respecting their passages into the afterlife. For the Altmer, it's very cruel to encourage or force a spirit to linger in this world, and so they find necromancy to be abhorrent and disgusting. Although they consider death to be a liberation for the spirit, they do have special punishments for those who live and or die in dishonor, by erasing any and all of their records out of their records of that person's existence. This makes them not to be considered ancestors any longer, and they will vanish from memory, a fate which is considered worse than death itself. As for funerary rites, the Altmer do not bury their death, although the more sentimental and longing ones may erect shrines or little mounds to remember their departed ones by. Instead, they cremate their dead and bury their ashes in shrines and mausoleums. Some of the most grandiose mausoleums, held by the families of kings and kinlords, often had successive generations buried there, and the current members of the family would treat the mausoleum as a temple to the ancestors, often going in there in search of guidance. But something interesting with this is that there are also special prison mausoleums dedicated to the souls of criminals or especially despised members of society. For all Muslims go that there are priests dedicated to blessing, warding and guarding such places from any desecration or necromancy, because as I said before, necromancy is considered extremely abhorrent in the eyes of the Altmer, and any necromancer caught in the Somerset Isles can wait probably the worst and most severe forms of punishment. Which makes, for example, Mende Marco, who was an Altmer, probably the most infamous necromancer of Tamrielic history, an interesting case, as his taking up necromancy would have meant that he would have never been welcome in the Somerset Isles again. Anyway, next up are the Imperials. The Imperials revere Arkay as their god of death, and they were also the ones to come up with the most well-known concept of Arkay way back in the First Era, when Saint Alessia established the 8 divines, synchronizing both elven and human elements in a religion in order to appease all of her subjects. Arkay, for instance, combines elements from Arkay, a human god, and Xarxes, an elven god. The Imperials believe that the souls of the dead depart to Aetherius after death, to join Arkay and all the other gods in Aetherius. They believe Aetherius to be the seat of the divine, so the Aedra specifically, and the source of all magica, which infuses the daily existence of everything, coming from Mundus via the sun and the stars. Imperial burial traditions are among the most widespread and most practiced on Tamriel, giving their influence in pretty much everything after conquering the whole continent. Imperials bury their dead in graveyards, both inside and outside of the proximity of towns and cities, or in catacombs, a practice most used by the noble and wealthy. Temples of Arkay hold catacombs of their own, usually reserved for priests or other important people to the community. Priests of Arkay protect and guard such places against defilement by, for example, necromancers. Pretty much every Imperial is anointed with the 3 consecrations of Arkay to protect and bless their souls, and even criminals about to be executed are granted this blessing. We can even witness this at the start of Skyrim, of course, when the priests give us the last rites, well, before, the Stormcloak soldier interrupts them. Necromancy, though, is a bit different than from the Altmer with the Imperials, because in Cyrodiil it's relatively common, despite it being mostly illegal or frowned upon for the general population, at least historically. But it's still less rare than in other places, since historically the Imperial government would sometimes grant corpses to necromancers in employ of the Imperial government to pursue academic research on the subject. It's not really known if the Mede dynasty kept this practice in the 4th era, so necromancy is probably now completely illegal in Cyrodiil, or maybe they're still doing it, but we know that it happened during the Septim and Riemann dynasties. Now, having talked about the Altmer and the Imperials, we will talk about the Argonians. The Argonians believe that their souls come from the Hist, given to them by drinking the Hist sap when they are born, and then returning to the Hist when they die. The Hist provides them with blood, breath and essence, which are the most important to them. So the Argonians don't really treat their dead, that is, as corpses, with much reverence or anything. Their funerary rites are really simple compared to most of the other races. When an Argonian dies, their body is laid to rest in the marsh, returning to the land and therefore to the Hist. Even Argonians who die away from the Hist, away from Black Marsh even, can still rejoin the Hist by simply having their bones returned to the marshes of the province, which actually gives a whole new dimension to the line that Hadvar says at the start of Skyrim if the player chooses to be an Argonian, because he then says, "I'm sorry, we'll make sure your remains are returned to Blackmarsh," which is actually in line with Argonian tradition. When the Argonians return their deceased to the Hist, they usually simply bury them or simply lay them on the ground with no cover at all. The deceased, though, does receive a funerary mask made of wood and a sulvat, which is a grave stake which impales and pins the body to the ground. This serves 3 purposes. 1, it prevents the corpse from floating around when the marsh inevitably floods, since that's what happens in marshes. 2, it prevents the corpse from returning as a bog blight, which is a sort of a zombie, although we don't really know much about bog blights at all. And also, the sulvat is carved with the story of life of that Argonian, their tales or feats in war, their childhood stories, names of friends, personality, dreams, anything. The sulvat tells the story of the deceased Argonian to whomever wishes to read upon it, until one day the sulvat, along with all of the body, is claimed by the swamp. Although, basically this whole funerary rite can be done anywhere in the swamp, it's not always as random, because the Argonians can also bury their dead just among the roots of a history in organized graveyards in places that held sentimental value to the deceased, or, like I said, simply where they fell down. Argonians also have special priests to deal with death whenever it comes to a tribe. They are called the Grave Singers. When death comes, they sing the departed one's final song while carving their sulvat, so the stake that is going, impaled in their body. They also serve as historians of sorts, reading the stakes of their tribe, which is very curious on a culture that sees everything as impermanent and temporary, not really giving much importance to the past and the future, at least not in the way we see the Argonians. Like the Altmer, Argonians also have punishments for those who dishonor or commit blasphemy against the Hist and the Saxhleel people. They do this by denying the deceased the ability to return to the Hist, by sealing their remains in a special urn. And in terms of necromancy, well, Argonians don't really care about necromancy. I mean, they'd rather not see it happen, but usually in the marshes their corpses decay so swiftly that necromancers usually don't even bother trying to go into Black Marsh to raise corpses. Now, next up are the Bosmer. The Bosmer do venerate both Arkay and Xarxes as gods of death, though they aren't nearly as important as the deity that they seem to see as their actual god of death of sorts, which is Ifre, the spirit of the now. Their views on death are dictated by the Green Pact, a covenant made with Ifre when the Bosmer were created from what they call the Ooze, according to their mythology. These customs are taught and maintained by the Spinners and the Three-Tanes, and they show little regard to ancestry and lineage, contrary to the Altmer, since Ifre is the spirit of the now. The Bosmer believe that when they die, their souls are reunited with their ancestors and Ifre in Aetherius, provided that they followed the Green Pact faithfully during their lives. The ones who didn't respect the Green Pact are said to return to the Ooze, which is the primordial formlessness before Ifre began telling his story, which they see as a hell-like punishment. Ifre erases the names of these sinners from the history and replaces them with silence. Bosmer are a very holistic race, so to speak, believing that everybody is deserving of a proper burial, either having obeyed the Green Pact or not, family or foe. The Green Pact clause, the meat mandate, requires that the Bosmer fully eat and consume their deceased before the time of 3 days have passed since their passing, never leaving the corpses to rot. The only thing the Bosmer usually bury for their funerary rites are skeletons, and then they treat basically every dead with the same amount of respect as Ifre will judge them after their passing. Also, since Bosmer architecture revolves around shaping trees to form residences and other structures, they don't really build things for the dead. Also, contrary to the Altmer, they don't build big structures to house their dead. In fact, most of the Bosmer burial grounds are simple groves. In any case, the Bosmer eat the flesh of their deceased and store the bones in ossuaries, which is a special place for the bones of the deceased. There are also some graveyards in Valenwood, though they are usually built and used by other races. Other races aren't allowed to have their remains laid in Bosmer ossuaries usually, as they are reserved for Bosmer only. Now, going back to the Green Pact, even apostate Wood Elves, so ones that didn't follow the Green Pact, are to be properly buried, though their ossuaries must be kept separated from those who actually did follow the Green Pact. So although they think Ifre will judge them after death, they will keep somewhat of a distinction between sinners and non-sinners, so to speak. As for necromancy, it's not super common in Valenwood, since bones alone are just more difficult to raise when they're up in a pile than just intact bodies. In fact, some Bosmer actually enjoy seeing their ancestors raised, as that way, and I quote directly from the game, that way their lazy ancestors are doing finally something constructive for a change, and then specifically the lazy ones in life. And finally, the Bosmer have, or at least used to have, a rather peculiar tradition, which is called the Morning War. When a tribe member, and this was in the early tribe phase, so not the ones that are living in cities right now, but when they were still organized in tribes, and some tribes in modern day Valenwood still do this, when a tribe member was slain, the Bosmer of said tribe would raid the neighboring tribes and take hostages. Usually one, but depending on the social standing, power and importance of the deceased, multiple hostages could be required. Such hostages then go through a period of vicious torture and testing, supposedly to test their worthiness. After a time then they are welcomed into the clan that kidnapped them, receiving the deceased position, possessions and family, in other words completely replacing whomever died. This is actually a really old tradition which dates back all the way to the early First Era, and even before that, before the Cameron dynasty would found the First Era, so even from the Meretic era. But currently right now it's only really done by tribal elves and no longer by those living in the cities, and even then it's a fading tradition, with even the tribal elves kinda letting it go. But alright, let's talk about the Khajiit now. The Khajiit follow the precipice of the Riddle Thar, which isn't a god but more like a concept. The Riddle Thar sets guidelines which all Khajiit must follow, and after death they would be separated between true cats and band cats, according to how they followed the path which was laid out to them by the Riddle Thar. True cats would be the ones who looked for and followed the right trail incessantly, trying the many different paths laid out by Joan and Jode. Following the right trail the whole of your life though is rough, and many Khajiit would grow bored with the chase and eventually turn into band cats, as they call it. That's why the Khajiit give a big importance to the many moon priests all around elsewhere, who help them stay on the right trail by sharing stories of their ancestors, telling tales of inspiration, and sometimes, as the book The Trail and Tide states, swatting the ones who stray upon their flanks until they return to the paths that the moons weave. When a Khajiit, which is considered to be a true cat, dies, their soul is taken by Canarthi to Lieswer, which is the sands behind the stars, which is sort of Khajiit Sovngarde/heaven, to play and pray until the next pounds. It's said that in Lieswer the dunes are made out of pure sugar, and the moonlight chorus delights all the cats with their song. Also, it's interesting that it's Canarthi who guides their souls to the afterlife, either directly to the sands behind the stars or to Azura to be judged. This is interesting because it parallels some Nord beliefs, but we'll get into that in due time. Band cats, on the other hand, are taken by Namira to the dark behind the world to serve Lorkhash and his frightful heart, essentially becoming Dro Maatra, or corrupted Khajiit. For more details on Lorkhash and his misdeeds, I recommend my video on Khajiiti mythology and creation myths, which Mr. Nerddragon also helped on. It's in the description of this video. He really likes the Khajiit. Can you tell? Anyway, another interesting piece of lore is that the Khajiit have their own variant, or so to speak, of Arkay's consecrations. A Dro Maatra, or a corrupted Khajiit, might try to bend a cat's soul and take it into the dark in a ritual called the Bend Dance, but this can be avoided by the ways of Joan and Jode, as those sort of consecrations are called. As for the burial traditions, the Khajiit usually bury their dead, resting their remains in coffins. The departed usually rest with their most valuable possessions or relics, and it's also very common for families to be buried together in the same place. Such burials are protected, or at least theoretically, by the moon priests. And there's something to consider though, and that's the difference between the burials of the Khajiit from Anaquina and the Khajiit from Palatine. Anaquina Khajiit mark their graves with a cairn of stones, and they don't really do much preparation on the corpse itself, for they believe that the desert will help preserve them longer. The Palatine Khajiit, on the other hand, bury their deceased underground, marking the spot with a single gravestone. Like the Anaquine cousins, they don't really prepare the body for burial, though it's for different reasons, since the humidity of the jungle of Palatine will rot the corpses faster, so there's no really preparation needed. There's also a difference between city Khajiit and tribal Khajiit on how they will treat their dead. City Khajiit are usually way richer, and some of the most rich and noble might even build grand tombs and mausoleums, housing generations of dead relatives and their treasure. But regardless of the Anaquine or Palatine origin of a city-dwelling Khajiit or even a tribal Khajiit, a common practice revolves around planting waning lilies on burial sites. So all Khajiit essentially do this, because these waning lilies symbolize the remembrance of those who departed. Now, as for necromancy, pretty much none of the Khajiit are anointed with Arkay's consecrations, not only due to the unique Khajiit religion, but also due to their emphasis of soul over body. So, after death they don't really care about the body, which is pretty clear, as they don't really work anything on the body anyway. So Khajiit generally don't really care about a grave being robbed even, which is rather unique among any other race of Tamriel. And as such, necromancy is quite common in elsewhere, as bodies are easily to obtain, and the Khajiit don't really seem to care all that much. Now, the next race that we'll talk about is a race that actually does hate necromancy, which is the Redguards. The Redguards believe that their death god is Tuwaka, who is often associated with Arkay in more cosmopolitan areas, such as Forebear territory. Though he also has a role similar to Kain or Canarthi in North and Khajiiti myths, taking the souls of the dead to the afterlife, in the far shores, as they call their version of the afterlife. Before the creation of the world, Tuwaka was the god of nobody really cares, which is literally what's stated in the lore, by the way. He was the god of nobody really cares, which is pretty hilarious. But he found his purpose after the Yokudan god Tal Papa created the Walkabout. Tuwaka then became manager of the Far Shores essentially, and the guide of Redguard souls to the Far Shore. In the Far Shores realm there is no hunger or thirst, and the Redguard souls can partake in a variety of martial arts, doing their enjoyment in combat for eternity. Redguards have a huge, and I mean huge, respect for their dead, in such a way that it's not hard to find resting places for the dead to be more complex and intricate than the abodes for the living, as they try to protect their dead against any who would disturb them. Redguards build vast necropolises for their dead, either close by or far from cities and settlements. For nobles, kings, warriors, and even for the commoners, this is all the same. So they build stuff for everybody, although stuff for the commoners is obviously usually smaller than those for the, nobles, as the nobles might build their own gigantic personal tombs, while commoners can only afford a small grave or place in one of the city necropolises. The Redguards also seem to be the only one who mummify their dead, as the art of mummification has been practiced since ancient times, since before the Ragana left Yokuda in fact. Mummification is something that originally came from Yokuda, and it's still done to this day. No matter the social standing of the deceased, everybody is mummified. The criminals, however, are usually left to rot in desecrated grounds in the desert, which are designed specifically to prevent their souls from resting, though it's possible for the souls to be consecrated if they are later to be proven innocent. The Redguard equivalent of Arkay priests are the Throne Keepers. They are priests in service of Tuwaka, who tend to the necropolises and to the dead. They are also responsible for embalming and mummifying the deceased. The dead and the rites for the dead are so respected that it's considered blasphemy to strike down a risen undead. Striking down an undead apparently carries a terrible curse, according to Redguard culture. So fighting against necromancy usually proves to be very difficult in Hammerfell, with, nobody being allowed to even strike down the risen undead. But even though they can hardly fight it, there is nothing more abhorrent to a Redguard than necromancy or desecration of the dead. To a level of them not even being willing to destroy a powerful undead such as a lich, but instead trying to usually seal the lich off under magical seals in some tomb instead of having to put it down. However, necromancers and their art must still be dealt with in some sort of organized manner. Therefore, there's a group called the Ash-Aba, which is a tribe of Redguards that takes upon themselves the role of fighting off the undead and keeping the people safe, with the cost of them being considered disgusting and cursed and a pariah, and they're usually being shunned by the rest of the populace. Whenever the dead rise, the Ash-Aba are called upon by the people, but otherwise they are never seen under a completely good light, as everybody just hates them, which actually really reminds me of the Witchers in The Witcher. Up next are the Bretons. The Bretons are pretty curious, since they descend from both the Need humans and the Durrani Elves, which are Altmer. Their faith and customs share and unite aspects of both cultures, since they revere Arkay as their god of death, and that they came to Arkay in the same way that the Imperials did, so as a combination of Orcay and Xarxes, so a combination of a human god and an elven god. Bretons are considered to be one of the most pious and religious peoples of Tamriel, being very devoted to the divines. They believe that Arkay keeps the balance between life and death and commands the souls of the deceased, and upon death they join with their gods and the ancestors in Aetherius. See the elven and human influence there, with human taken as Imperials. And it doesn't stop there though, since the Durrani, who are High Elves, left their mark on the old Bretons in other customs as well, since nothing matters more to a High Elf than their bloodline and ancestry, and the Bretons took from that. They maintained pretty much the same power structures from that time, and kings and nobles would build complex and long intricate family trees to both justify their status as noble and keep their status in High Rock. As such, prestigious ancestors and prestigious bloodlines are often held in very high esteem in High Rock, although not for the same reason as the Elves. But you can still see Elvish influence there. As for funerary rites, earlier records tell us that cremation was the rule among the Nedic ancestors of the Bretons, and as such, cremating remained to be the most important funerary rite for the Bretons, that is, until the Cyrodiilic Empire added High Rock to its territory, which then started to influence the funerary customs in southern and later all of High Rock. Because by the Second Era, cremation as a funerary custom was all but abandoned. Now both kings and peasants would bury their dead underground, either in catacombs or in simple graves, a practice more akin to their Imperial cousins. Kings and nobles would be buried in crypts and catacombs, but often in places outside the city, akin to the Altmer. Bretons also have a separate treatment for the dishonorable, burying them in separated and isolated spots, to be forgotten by both history and their descendants. Commoners, on the other hand, are usually buried just in graveyards, either in the city or out the city. They're resting in a simple coffin, or in an either individual or familial grave or tomb. Priests of Arkay often guard these places to prevent necromancy, but even if the vast majority of Bretons received the 3 consecrations of Arkay, necromancy usually still is very highly practiced in High Rock compared to the other provinces, due to the amount of corpses who are left in battlefields with no blessings or protections at all. Because these battlefields, they're all the results of the endless squabbles and little wars between High Rock's nobles and kings, who have basically fought each other for centuries. Now, next let's talk about the Orsimer or the Orcs. First things first, there are some differences in belief between Orcs that follow Malakath, which is arguably the majority of Orcs, and the few Orcs that still follow Trinamach. First we'll talk about the followers of Malakath. The followers of Malakath believe that upon death they are sent to the Ashen Forge, which is Malakath's fortress in his plane of oblivion. There their souls are becoming immortal, and they will enjoy constant food, drink, sex and battle. It's curiously similar to the Nord concept of Sovngarde, especially when you remember that most Orc strongholds, when feeling old age, those Orcs usually go and look for a good death in the wilds. In the Ashen Forge, it's said that every Orc is a chief, and every chief has 1,000 wives. Remember the constant sex part. And every wife to the chieftain has 1,000 slaves that they can tend to. Interestingly enough, we don't really know what happens to a female Orc when they die. Nothing in the lore tells us what happens to a female Orc who dies. Maybe they become part of those thousands of wives for every chief. But that seems like a bit of a bummer for the afterlife, or maybe they themselves just get 1,000 husbands. I don't know. In any way, what we do know is that the Ashen Forge is a massive place, which is constructed with iron and steel, with gigantic towers and bastions stretching across the stars, and with huge longhouses around the center of the fortress. This forge is integral to the Orcs' afterlife, for it's said that its coals, which burn hotter than the sun, are fueled by the Orcs' adherence to the code of Malakath. When an Orc dies, they must be tempered in the Ashen Forge before joining their brethren in feast and battle. This process revolves around the Forge taking their grudges, melting and forging them into the next generation of Orcs, though particularly strong and deep grudges may be forced by Malakath himself into legendary weapons and armor, or Daedric artifacts. Trinamach following Orcs, on the other hand, believe something very different. They believe that they go to Aetherius upon death to rejoin their ancestors. This afterlife also consists of constant warfare in Aetherius and shows of might, but a bigger emphasis is put on being with your late ancestors once more, which kinda goes back to their elvish ancestry. As for Orcish funerary rites, cremation is their main practice regarding all of Malakath or Trinamach following. Their bodies are cremated down to ashes, which is then handed to their kin. Ashes of kings, chiefs and other important leaders are then forged into arms and armor in the reflection of Malakath's own practices in the Ashen Forge. The late Orcs' ashes would then be placed under a cairn out in the open, under the sky, with the most important Orcs, such as kings, being placed on high mountaintops. The cairn would also hold the departed's weapons and armor, and their relatives pay their respects at the cairn. Orcs don't tend to bury their dead at all, but despite their usual ruthlessness and brutality, they do respect other races' burial traditions, going as far as to bury their fallen enemies according to their own rites, meaning that the Orcs actually build catacombs and graves for other races after battle. Orc corpses are highly sought after by necromancers due to their sturdy skin and their strong bones, since they decay less quickly. There was a time that a delegation of the Worm Cult even went to Orsinium to convince the king to let them dispose of the dead. Such negotiations never came to fruition though, since the Orcs abhor and despise any sort of necromancy. And usually it doesn't really happen to their bodies since they're cremated. Alright, next up are the Nords. The Nords are one of the most fleshed out races regarding their death beliefs, and part of it is due to the latest main game taking place in Skyrim. I mean, we even go to Sovngarde at the end of the main quest. Speaking of Sovngarde, it's the Nordic afterlife, though it's rather exclusive, because a Nord isn't judged for how they lived, but rather how they died. Nords that prove themselves and die a warrior's death in battle go to Sovngarde upon death. Nords that die peacefully, be it by disease, old age or any similar reason, simply go to Aetherius to join the Aedra. In other words, you might be the biggest asshole of all, the evilest and cruelest tyrant that ever roamed the land, but as long as you die in battle, you're completely fine. Unfair? Maybe, but that's how it is. And it's not really like Aetherius is bad or anything. And no matter if you died eviscerated, decapitated or mangled in any way, your spirit will still be in peak condition when in Sovngarde. There's even a word wall which reflects this philosophy, which says, "Noble Nord, remember these words from the Whorefather. Fear not the spectre of death, for he is the herald of glory and your guide to great Sovngarde." But within Sovngarde there is also the Hall of Valor, which is Shor's palace, reserved for only the greatest Nord heroes of all. Anyone can gain access to it, but they have to face Tsun, the god of trials, in combat and defeat him, which grants them permission to cross over the Whalebone Bridge into the hall itself. One can also be allowed into the hall by getting invited by Shor himself, though that's a very rare instance. In the Hall of Valor there is no pain, no illness, meat is overflowing and food is endless. And the Nord heroes face each other in tests of metal. There are even spectral enemies in the shadows for those who do not want to fight other Nords but still want to fight. In other words, the Hall of Valor is basically one big fight club and drinking club, but better. It's theorized that Shor is gathering all these heroes in his halls to form a mighty army at the end of this iteration of the world and at the start of the next, to then use to conquer it or whatever. But that's just a theory. As for funerary customs, Nords usually bury their departed ones in halls of the dead, which doubles as catacombs and temples of Arkay or Orkay back in the earliest eras. Priests of Arkay are trained, sometimes since they were children, to perform the funeral rites. The Nordic priests of Arkay usually live very solitary lives, often seen as outcasts by other parts of the population. These priests have ceremonial daggers as a symbol of office, and also an amulet of Arkay, which works as a source of divine power and helps them hold off the dead if they ever become restless. Smaller settlements would have graveyards or small barrows in place of halls of the dead, which is usually only for the cities, where they place the corpses and are laid in coffins, or they're just buried. And if they're buried, they just mark the spot with a gravestone. Sometimes it's needed to wait for the ground to thaw out, given the harsh climate, but the cold also helps preserve the corpses once they're in the ground. Some bigger Nord clans would often have their own clan barrows, with their descendants taking care of it, and sometimes kings and other important figures would have their own grand barrows, secluded from populated areas. Think for example about Ysgramur's tomb, which we can actually find in Skyrim. Corpses are buried in such barrows that would often be embalmed, although modern Nords no longer seem to embalm their dead judged by Skyrim. A less practiced and uncommon kind of funeral rite, though, for Nords, although it's not really seen badly, just less common, is a fire burial or cremation in a pyre, like what happened to Kotelek Whitemane at the end of the Companion's questline. And in a very similar vein, ship burial would also happen in ancient times, which works pretty much the same as ship burials in our real-life Viking history. The departed would be laid in a ship filled with loot and kindling, and then flaming arrows would be shot at the departing ship from a distance, laying it ablaze. As for necromancy, we don't really have more in-lore leads or information on the Nord stance, but given the Nordic climate, of preserving the bodies better, and the amount of necromancers that we actually find in Skyrim, and also the presence of a lot of Draugr and ancient tombs everywhere, it would be fair to assume that necromancy is relatively common in Skyrim. Now, finally, we've come to the Dark Elves, or Dunmer, actually one of the most fleshed out cultures, given their unique relationship with death. For starters, the Dunmer don't really make a distinction between Mundus, Aetherius and Oblivion. regarding all of them as part of a big whole, with many paths coming and going with no distinct borders. As such, Dark Elves believe that death isn't the end, but the beginning. Considering all this, it's no surprise to know that the departed Dunmer spirits most usually persist after death to guide, counsel and protect the descendants. The bond shared between ancestors and living Dunmer is partly blood, partly ritual and partly volitional. For a spirit, it's not a pleasant experience to linger in a mortal world because it's filled with pain, but Dunmer ancestors, despite not liking it, endure of their own volition to better protect their family and bloodline after death, considering it to be an honor-bound duty. So they will linger of their free will. Such spirits will always recognize their blood and kindred. However, if an ancestor spirit is displeased or angry with a descendant, they might even attack their own descendants. But curiously, even a stranger can earn their trust and favor if they pay the proper respects at the family shrines. There are cases where a spirit is bound against their will to protect their family shrines. This is most often a punishment for a dishonorable family member. Usually though, those spirits go mad and make for terrifying guardians of shrines. The other spirits of the faithful, are the ones to restrict and keep those rogue spirits in check. They are prevented from harming their own blood, which does not prevent mischievous behavior towards said blood, but still prevents them from harming it. But those spirits are particularly dangerous for intruders. Now, there's also the risk of an intruder pertaining the spirit's madness and preying on their resentment of the clan, essentially manipulating the spirit for their own gain. Necromancers usually take advantage of this. As for specific customs, Dunmer are usually cremated upon death, so he might return to the ash from whence they came. Such as philosophy is actually really similar to real-world Christianity, with the whole "thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return." Now, remember when I said back then that the Dunmer spirits protect their family tombs? And there is another form of protection called the ghost fence. Sometimes an ancestor, as a sign of honor and sacrifice, may offer part of their remains to power a ghost fence, which is essentially a spiritual barrier protecting the family's tomb and shrine and household. The remains used become also a beacon for the other family spirits. Such arrangements are usually recorded beforehand in a will, stating that a bone shall be part of a ghost fence with all the solemn respect and ceremony. There are some ways to make a ghost fence more powerful, with a bigger quantity of remains for instance. As such, there also exist really powerful ghost fences where multiple whole bodies are basically used to power it. And the strength of the person who actually powers it also matters, so if a particularly powerful soul is used to power it, the ghost fence will be more powerful. The Great Ghost Fence around Red Mountain at the time of the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind was an example of this, with many House Dunmer offering their remains to power it. Each House Dunmer family has their own shrine, which may vary in size depending on the family's wealth, from simple alcoves to the grand ancestral tombs. Such shrines are called the Waiting Door, and there are the family members, they can pay their respects there, doing oaths and sacrifices, praying or simply telling what's happening currently within the family to the deceased. In exchange, the spirit offer guidance, training and blessing for the living relatives. It's a kind of heartwarming relationship really. Imagine chatting with your departed loved ones about the ins and outs of your family as they're actually responding and actually try to help you. As for Ashlanders, they simply bury the cremated remains of their dead and mark the place with a cairn with the possessions of the departed individual. Ashlanders would usually come to such cairns to pay their respects, leaving offerings to the most honored ones. Many see the fact of the Dunmer commuting with the dead in such a way as necromancy, but any dark elf would tell you otherwise, since the spirits remain in the world, usually at least of their own volition. Because actual necromancy is very frowned upon by the Dunmer, although in the Third Era some would practice it upon enslaved races. Some Telvanni mages, for example, were rather talented necromancers. And this concludes our very long look into the Tamrielic traditions regarding the dead. It's been quite a journey. There's more to cover about the races, but for the moment this video was already so long that I thought it would be best to just stick to the 10 playable races. We might explore other minor traditions on another occasion. So, with that, I would like to thank you all for watching this very long video, and I hope you liked it. And thank you to Mr. Nerddragon for helping me out with this video. And thanks for all my Patreon supporters for making all this possible. And yeah, I'm going to sleep now. Happy Halloween, everybody. See you later.